If you're starting out with jazz and you're overwhelmed with the amount of chords in a 32 measure standard, this lesson is for you. Likewise, if you gig with a band that occasionally wants you to solo over some jazz standards, but you're still not comfortable doing so over lots of chord changes, I am going to show you a simple solution. That is, how to simplify almost any standard down to its bare bone harmony. I'm Richie Zullen, and I'm happy to welcome you to the Jazz Guitar channel. Did you know that the harmonic essence of many jazz standards can be reduced down to just 2 chords? I'm talking about the 5/7 or dominant chord and the 1 chord or tonic. These are the 2 principal chords needed to establish a key center or tonality. Let's take, for instance, Autumn Leaves. Did you know that the entire progression can be boiled down to just a D7 resolving to a G major? I'm going to improvise over the first 8 measures of the original progression twice. The first time you'll hear me playing and thinking over the original changes. However, the second time around, I'm just going to think and solo over D7 and G major 7 while the original changes play in the background. You will hear that although it doesn't sound as polished or sophisticated as when I'm actually thinking over the true changes, the notes of the D7 Mixolydian and G Ionian can actually do the job here. After this, I'll explain the underlying principle, so if needed, you too can apply it. Not too shabby considering the limitations. But note that even when it swings, resorting to this practice will sound bland because it lacks the use of upper extensions and the targeting of the actual chord tones that imply the original harmony. In spite of this, it's a great temporary solution for the jazz newbie that needs to get through the changes until he or she can get all the required scales and arpeggios down. And I want to stress temporary solution. If you want your lines to have a sense of direction and properly outline the underlying chord changes, you must learn to use their true corresponding scales and arpeggios. Now that I've made my disclaimer, let me explain the theory and procedure. And yes, there is a minimum requirement. In a nutshell, you just need to know how to play the Mixolydian mode in the major scale or Ionian mode, preferably in any key. The first step is to analyze the chord progression and isolate all the 2-5-1s. In other words, you must at least understand what major and minor 2-5-1 cadences are. Both types of cadences can and will appear within the same tune, whether the overall piece is in major or minor. But in order to simplify it, we need to understand how to temporarily relate all the chords to a major tonic. And to do this, we need to learn 3 simplification principles. 1. Once you've identified your major 2-5-1s, if you still can't incorporate the Dorian scale over the 2 minor, simply ignore it for the time being and instead anticipate the dominant in its place and employ the notes of its corresponding Mixolydian. This works in part because the notes of the D Dorian are the same as those of its diatonically related Mixolydian. By the way, if you know the Dorian, the reverse is also an option. And this was one of Pat Martino's favorite superimposition resources. Number 2, for a 2 minor 7 flat 5 and 5/7 flat 9 or dominant, you can for the time being improvise over the duration of both chords employing the Mixolydian, which starts a major third below the root of the 2 minor 7 flat 5 chord. So if you have an F sharp, minor 7 flat 5 and a B7 flat 9, you would use the mixolydian a major third below from the F sharp's root, and this would in turn be D mixolydian. And this works because the notes of the F sharp Locrian, which is the scale that corresponds to a minor 7 flat 5 chord, are the same as those of its diatonically related mixolydian. Furthermore, any minor 7 flat 5 chord can be viewed as a dominant ninth chord, with the root being the third of the dominant. Number 3. For the 1 minor 7 and a minor 2-5-1, you can use its relative major scale, which is situated a minor third up from its root. So if we have an E minor 7, we would use a G major or Ionian scale. So like I said earlier, we are relating everything to a major tonic. Next, let me improvise over the second half of Autumn Leaves using these principles so you can see how it's possible to get through the entire tune just using the dominant and tonic scales in the key of G major. Now, let's do this over a relatively more complex standard which many beginning jazz students fail to understand and have a hard time improvising over. And I'm referring to All the Things You Are. This one has several modulations. We are starting on an F minor 7, which is not a 2 minor 7. So let's begin by applying the third principle I mentioned. Let's use its major relative instead, which is A flat major 7. And this is followed by a 2-5-1 and A flat, so we'll apply the initial principle and just play over the E flat 7 and the A flat major 7. The next line begins with a D flat major 7, which is the 4 chord in the key of A flat. Here we can just keep playing over the A flat major, which has the same notes as D flat Lydian, which corresponds to the 4 major. Right after this, we are modulating to the key of C major. Over the D minor 7 flat 5, we can apply the second principle, which consists of using a mixolydian, a major third below the root of the D minor 7 flat 5, in this case, over both the D minor 7 flat 5 and the G7. And that would be a B flat mixolydian. Since this is not a pure minor cadence due to the fact that it resolves to a C major 7 instead of a C minor, we also have the option to simply ignore the 2 minor 7 flat 5 and instead play entirely over the G7 in its place. This way it would resolve a perfect fifth down to the C major. Immediately after this, it once again modulates. So this time we are using the third principle and therefore the relative major of C minor 7, which is E flat major 7. Like in the first part, it is followed by a 2-5-1 in E flat major, going to its 4 chord, which is A flat major 7. So we are doing everything we did earlier in the first 8 measures. Let me improvise over this first section so you can hear how it sounds while I limit myself to using only the dominant and major scales. Since you are limited to only a few scales, the challenge here is to use your ear to create the best melodies possible under the circumstances. And this is actually a great ear training exercise in disguise. If you can create fairly good sounding music at this level, when you learn and start adding the original corresponding scales, you will do so with much more ease and won't be so overwhelmed. That said, before I proceed to show you what is going on in the rest of the tune, I want to let you know that if you are starting out with jazz and you find this useful, I've prepared a special study package including simplified chord sheets so you can improvise using these concepts not only over Autumn Leaves and All the Things You Are, but also over rhythm changes, tune-up, Blue Bossa, Satin Doll, There Will Never Be Another You, How High the Moon, and Night and Day. That's a total of 8 popular jazz standards that you can get your feet wet improvising over if you are just starting out with jazz improvisation. I also include a PDF with an explanation of the simplification principles covered in this lesson so you can refer to them as needed. All of this is available for download for a very nominal contribution. Just go to jazzguitar.richiezelland.com/premium and you will find the lesson under Special Lessons. And we are ready to continue with All the Things You Are. The B section begins after a modulation to the key of G. And since I want to improvise over the rest of the tune so you can hear the effect of these principles, I'm not going to go into much detail as to what exactly happens in each measure. But I'm sure if you can understand the 3 simplification principles I've been applying, you should be able to easily figure it out. There are, however, 3 continuous measures that require some explanation as they are not included in the procedures I've covered. The first one is the D flat minor 7 appearing in the 6th measure of the C section. Is there a doctor in the house? Okay, let's get serious. The D flat minor 7 here is the 4 minor of A flat major. So whenever we have a minor chord over the 4th degree of the current tonal cadence, we can view it as the first half of a 2-5 cadence. So we simply add its 5 chord, which would be located a perfect 4th up or a perfect 5th down, and play over it instead. So in the case of D flat minor 7, its relative 5-7 would be G flat 7. And of course this works because G flat 7 has the same notes as the D flat minor 7's corresponding Dorian scale. The next one is the C minor 7 appearing in the 7th measure of the C section. As I stated earlier, we are here in the key of A flat major. If a minor chord that is not part of a 2-5 appears over the 3rd degree of a major key, it is interchangeable with the 1 chord and vice versa. That's because it has a secondary tonic function, as is also the case with any minor chord over the 6th degree of a major key. That's the relative minor. So here we can replace the C minor 7 for the A flat major scale. The final chord requiring an explanation is the measure that follows, which contains a B diminished. In case you're not aware of it, any diminished chord has a dominant function. In most cases, it is functioning as a dominant 7 flat 9 chord in disguise. This might be too complicated for me to explain in detail if you are not well versed in theory. So let me simplify it all by just stating that you can instead play over the regular dominant, which begins a half step below the diminished chord's root. So in the case of B diminished, that would be B flat 7, or in terms of scales, for now just use a B flat mixolydian. And this should get you through that measure until the day you are ready to play the true corresponding scale, the 8-note symmetrical diminished. So now that we have reduced every chord in All the Things You Are down to a dominant or tonic, let me improvise over it while constraining myself to these resources. Note that I will use only the mixolydian and Ionian scales and arpeggios, and maybe some occasional neighboring tones. So if you are new at jazz, I'd love to know if this lesson has been helpful. So please be sure to leave me a comment. On the other hand, if you're an intermediate player, I'd be curious to know if you saw how you can use this information to instead jazzify with more chord changes any tune that could use more harmony. If this is your first time on the Jazz Guitar channel and you enjoyed this lesson, there is a lot more where this came from. So please like and subscribe and be sure to click on that bell icon so you'll be notified of my upcoming lessons. Until we meet again, be sure to practice, 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 and may peace be with you. Hasta la vista.